Today I'm going to show you my process for creating super simple jelly plate prints with lots of texture using mainly things I have around the house already and a few stencils. And this is great for beginners, or if you just want to think of a few extra things you can use around the house to create some texture on your jelly plate prints. And at the end of my video, I'll also show you how I use these papers as my pattern paper for Kendra's card challenge by simply adding a few stamps onto the paper as well. However, some of these you don't even need anything else added onto them. So when I first set myself up to start creating jelly plate prints, it's super addictive and I just keep going and make a whole heap at once and store them in a box so I have them down the track. But there comes a point where I end up having too many, and that's why using them up on Kendra's card challenge was such a great idea. To set myself up, I initially get my jelly plate out, a few paints, a spare bit of paper, as well as lots of papers to print onto, and my brayer. I also have some water in a spray bottle, which for today's techniques I find will really add a lot of extra texture to our pages. However, you don't need to use the water with it. I'm mixing my paints on the Mixed Media Tim Holtz glass mat, but you don't need that to do this. You can use anything else like a glass plate from the microwave, for example, or just any vellum that you have. You can put the paints directly onto your jelly plate, but sometimes I find you end up with too much paint on there. So for this technique, I'm just going in with lots of random spots of coloured paint throughout, and I keep rolling my brayer onto the spare bit of paper so that it doesn't become muddy. As the acrylic paints are water-based, I then just spray some water over the paints before putting my bit of paper on top and pulling it off, and it slightly reacts with that water. I then didn't think there was enough colour on that jelly plate print, so I just go in again and lift up a little bit more paint after spraying some water down. And that's the fun of doing jelly plate prints. You can just go in as many times as you like and add more and more layers, and more layers will also help create that depth, will prevent the colours mixing too much and becoming a brownish colour. To clean your jelly plate, you can just use a spare bit of paper and do another print to pull any extra colour off, and these usually end up the nice, fun, surprising prints. Or you can use just a damp cloth to wipe it down. For the next style of jelly plate print, I'm just doing a hue of colours, so using two colours, which I put the colours down first, and then with a clean brayer, I go in the middle section and grab a bit of both colours to help them blend together. As I pull the print off, you can see where I've gone in with the water, and if you don't like that look, you don't need to use the water, but I really like the way it reacts with the water. Now, not all jelly prints turn out the way we want them to, but that's okay because usually you can save the print. So this first one I'm going in with a bit of brown, and the initial image doesn't turn out as I had hoped, but it creates a great base for the next layer. And you can see that our little side bit of paper there that I'm just using to get rid of the excess on my brayer is becoming a really nice, colourful piece of paper, and I actually always use this bit of paper as well. So you can use really everything that you end up creating. And if you want to get more shades of the same colour, I just go in and use a bit of white paint as well. And now I really like the way this page is turning out. And now for the first thing that I've found around the house to use, it's quite a common one, and that's just using your egg carton, the very base of it, to press a few prints onto the jelly plate, which then removes paint in that section. And you can see how nice it looks when it gets pulled off. Another great one to use is bubble wrap, which I have used in a video previously with my Easter eggs video, and you can check that out as well if you're interested. But that's also a fun one to play around with. For the next one, I'll be using some leftover recycled netting from some fruit, and it really creates a really fun crisscross shape on the jelly plate. And for the colours, once again, I'm just going in with the random colours, and I'm going in with a little bit more paint to try and get it to be a brighter, more colourful page than the last one we created, and just really gently mixing them while taking the brayer, while cleaning the brayer in between. And then I'm using the brayer to push that netting into the jelly plate really gently and just remove some of that paint. And you can see how cool that looks. And when we pull this off, in the sections where we've pulled the paint off, it will show through to the colour of the page in the background. If you don't want that, you can let the jelly plate dry a little bit and go in with a base colour. And then you can see my brayer is creating a few sort of marks on the jelly plate, and I actually quite like that. Just add something extra to the page. But if you don't like that, you can either use a wider brayer or just not push as hard as I'm pushing down. This next layering of colours I find super simple but so effective. And I just go in and make a few rows of colours, making sure to clean my brayer between each colour. And then I blend the colours just slightly by moving from the top colour to the bottom colour. And it really doesn't need anything else added on top of the paper once you create it. It's one of my favorites, and I certainly use it in Kendra's card challenge as one of my pattern papers. It's such a cheap way to create your own pattern papers without always having to buying them, and that way you have a lot of variety and you have pattern papers that no one else has because there's only one of a kind. That can be a little bit frustrating with the jelly plate process, that you really sometimes can't make it again even though you want to, but it's also fun as well. Now, if you find the paper sticks to your jelly plate, an easy way to peel it off is to actually flip it upside down so that the paper's underneath with the jelly plate on top, and peel off the jelly plate instead of the paper, and that way you don't bend your paper. To reactivate any of the colours on your jelly plate, just spray it with some water and then use some other paper to go on top and pull the colour off. And see, this is another accidental, really nice page. It was just to clean my jelly plate, but wow, look at that. Turned out really well. And then just wanted to make one piece of paper that was all just one colour. Very simple, so that I can do some stamping over the top, and that way I can create my own sort of pattern paper for Kendra's card challenge with a more simple background to make sure it doesn't look too busy, but it still certainly doesn't look simple. And then I wanted to do it again for a yellow bit of paper. I wanted to do a bit of stenciling with a different colour on top. So once all my original jelly plate prints have dried, I then want to go in and add a bit of something extra to all of them. So for the yellow page that we just created, I wanted to use a really subtle color, so this more beige cream color. And I'm just going to cover my Gelli plate with that and then put a stencil on top. And then I'm going to press the Gelli plate, the previous Gelli plate print on top. And that way I'll just get those letters showing through. And I really make sure to press between all the gaps in the stencil. So I love how it's really subtle on this page, but you can still see it. I'm going to let that aside to dry and add a little bit of extra stamping on top. And because we don't want to waste the acrylic paint that's beautifully stenciled off on our Gelli plate, I'm just going to add it on top of this other page. Unfortunately, you can't see it much, but sometimes these inverse prints work really well. And then I'm going to clean up my leftover paints on the right side by just smearing it onto another bit of paper, because it actually gives a really fun look. And I love cleaning up my extra paints this way because you may as well not waste it. So for this background, I'm using not a Gelli plate print, but the leftover piece that I cleaned my brayer onto. And I really like the colors on this. And so I thought, why not use it? But I don't find it's perfect as is to use. So I wanted to sort of cover up components of it. And so I thought using a stencil was a perfect way to do that. However, I want the color showing through like you can see it now where the stencil is. So I sort of want the inverse print on my Gelli plate. And I'm going to use black acrylic paint on my Gelli plate. And so when you're using this technique, I find you need a little bit more acrylic paint than you do with some of the other techniques. So I'm going to use a scrap piece of thin paper first and take off the actual stenciled image. And then I want to use this other section on my actual paper. And the reason why you need a little bit more acrylic paint than normal is, one, so it stays, I guess, wet enough for when I then imprint it onto the Gelli plate. And this is how it's turned out. So I absolutely love this technique, and it's not too black, so you can still see a little bit of the color through the black. And I do find this technique works much better if you use thin paper to take the imprint off where the stencil is, because you can really get in the gaps a lot easier. So for these Gelli plate prints, they're really nice and simple, and that's what I wanted, as I wanted to do some stamping over the top. So the type of stamps I'm going to use for the stamping is mainly completely filled in stamps, and that's because I wanted that stark contrast between my Gelli plate print and my stamping. But you can choose any stamps that you have, and I find it really works for any stamps. I just like to pick stamps that are small, slightly smaller in shape for the majority of them. So if you have one super large image, it can work. It just depends what the image is and what you're going to use it for. Like this one here. And I like to use images that generally don't matter in what direction you stamp them. Once again, depending what you're using it for. And for Kendra's card challenge, generally you want papers that are bi-directional. And flowers and leaves and butterflies and birds, I feel like, you know, they can always be going in all directions. And then I just go around and stamp the images everywhere. And it depends how busy you want the page. I personally wanted my page to be quite full, and that's to represent, I guess, what pattern paper normally is. There's lots of repetition of similar images, and that's what I was going for the cards that I'll be making. So you can really design yours dependent on what you're using them for and what type of look you're going for. And I find that this is really fun to create, and no matter how the page turns out, it's always so easy to use in so many ways, not just card making. You can do scrapbooking and journaling with them as well. And even if you think it looks a little bit too busy initially, I find often you cover up backgrounds as you create your project, so the busyness gets taken away as you work with the page. Now, the type of ink that I'm using is the Memento dye ink. However, keep in mind that for sometimes it does help to use a pigment ink if it's not stamping properly on top of the acrylic paint. Both of them are reactive with water. So that's the Memento dye ink, and the acrylic paint are both reactive with water. So if you do want to create another layer on top of this, then what I would recommend is covering the page once this is dry with some clear gesso, and that will create this barrier so that whatever you're using on the layer on top of that, it won't react with what's underneath that clear gesso. So if you want to use water on top, that's fine, even though the layer underneath does contain water reactive products. The page that I'm creating is larger than the size that I need for Kendra's card challenge. For that I need 6 by 6 inches. However, I thought I could use the leftover strips either to decorate another card or cut out some of the other shapes like these butterflies to decorate some of the cards. I often stamp the stamps that are more foam based with my hand, and the clear stamps using the clear block. Here I was just trying to play around and find what stamps I wanted to use, but I found it was easier to stamp each of the stamps separately rather than together. I thought I would do it together, and that way I could save some time, but I decided I wanted them overlapping a little bit, and so easy if I stamp them individually to tie it more together. And I love this cute bird, and it's got beautiful words through the bird, which then show the Gelli Plate print colour underneath. And it just says, you know, believe and dream, and I think it's such an adorable stamp, this one. I'll have a link to all the stamps and products that I'm using in my description box below in case you are interested. But I definitely would recommend just try this technique and play around with what you have initially, because it always surprises you with how much you can get out of the items you already have. And if you're worried about stamping directly onto the paper without your MISTI and you're worried about it not stamping 100%, I don't think it matters at all. It adds to the character of the paper. So far, I've been creating really colourful and bright backgrounds, which is something that I normally really like, but I wanted to also create some darker backgrounds because that creates really nice contrast as well. So I'm going to start with just using a bit of a silver acrylic paint, a bit of black and white without mixing the black and white in 100%. I like sort of seeing it mix on the Gelli plate. And that way we've got a few more shades on the paper. And then I'm going to use just some paper towel with some pattern on it to pull up some extra colour from the page and spray a bit of water on top as well. So there'll also be sections that react with the paper. And I love how this turns out. It's so simple and such a nice pattern that I think it's a perfect background page. And then I became a bit addicted to it, so I just made a few extra because why not while we're going. And once again, the paper is sticking slightly to the jelly plate, so I just flip it over and pull the jelly plate off the paper. And wow, what a surprise this has turned out to be. There must have been some green in the background on my jelly plate that hasn't been cleaned off properly in the past. And this is one reason why never to properly clean a jelly plate, because I love that this is pulled through. I mean, I can just imagine this to be a bit of moss on, in the background on some sort of stone print that I can put on top. This is just beautiful. I love the way this has turned out. And as the paper towel one worked out so well, I thought I'll also use a sponge. So a sponge has a really nice texture on it as well. So I'm going to go in with the same colors and see how it looks with just using a dry or slightly damp sponge. Both works. And just pushing it down in certain sections of the jelly plate, so not everywhere. And that looks really nice as well. I also love this technique. So another thing that you just have lying around in the house can just be an old sponge that you're going to throw out anyway. And while you're going and have everything dirty, why not just make another one as well? Oh, and I love how this one turned out as well. So another way to decorate your jelly plate prints or any paper is by using stamps and not just stencils. So here I've got the Stampers Anonymous Tim Holtz slate and stone stamp set. So I'm going to grab the stony looking one because the pages that we just created gave me that inspiration. And then I'm going to use my brayer to paint some acrylic paint on top of the stamp. So I thought I'll try the white because the background's quite dark, and that way we get a good coverage over that stamp. And then you can either push the stamp down onto the paper if you want to see exactly where it's going, or push the paper slightly down on the stamp. Doesn't matter which way you do it. Another way I love using these stamps is actually pushing the stamp onto my jelly plate when there's already some acrylic paint there, and you leave this imprint of the shape of the stamp on your jelly plate. That has turned out really well. And now, because for Kendra's card challenge we need a 6x6" paper, I'm just going to do another print, but this time I wanted it to line up exactly with my other stamping. So I'm flipping it this way so I can see what I'm doing on the paper. And I love how that has turned out. That is an awesome background. So this is the last technique I'm going to go through today, as it's been a very long video already. So thank you if you are still watching. For this technique, I'm just going to use some texture paste, a stencil, and a jelly plate print as the background, as well as some acrylic paints. And I'm just going to mix in some acrylic paint with my texture paste. And then I'll grab a bit of each colour as I go and add it to my stencil. And I love the hue of colours it creates through the stencil. And I should have left a bit more room for me to mix the paint in with my texture paste, but that's okay, we get there. And I didn't want to create too much because I was only making a few pages like this. And it actually lasted me a lot more than what I thought, and I ended up creating some additional prints just onto some black paper, which looked amazing as well. In terms of the ratio of acrylic paint to texture paste, I certainly try and make sure I have more texture paste than acrylic paint. The paint is just the amount you need to get the color that you want, but otherwise you'll lose the integrity of the texture paste if you add too much of the acrylic paint. So Normally I would, as a maximum, go 1/4 acrylic paint and 3/4 texture paste, but really that's just my preference. Just play around with what works with the brand of texture paste that you have and how well you find it works through the stencil and dries. Now, I did find that in some areas I did put a little bit too much of the texture paste through the stencil, and so there were areas that it did smear. And if you miss the stencil, it doesn't matter too much, it adds a bit of color. I didn't mind that, but for some cards where I'm being a lot more pedantic around the way it looks and it's not, I guess, being more of a background, I would cover those sections with some paper or sticky notes, as it is quite a small stencil. And when you're making numerous prints, be aware that there could be some texture paste or paint underneath the stencil, so clean that off as well if you're wanting a clear print and using it numerous times. Thankfully, I'm using these on cards where I'm going to be putting sentiments and other things on top, so I'm just going to cover the areas where the texture paste has smeared with some embellishment or sentiment. I love the way these turned out. Just make sure you set them aside to dry overnight or as long as your texture paste needs. And if I do want to cover that up, I could just go over it with some extra ink over the top or acrylic paint to cover it up. So once all my papers were created and dry, I chopped them down to the 6 by 6 inches that I need for my project. And this is the way they've all turned out, and I absolutely love the way they look. And if you want to see how my cards turned out, I have posted that video already, and I'll pop the link here for you as well to check it out if you are keen to see the way I've used these Gelli Plate prints on my cards. And if you want to participate in Kendra's card challenge, all my details are in that video as well. And that goes until June, the end of June 2023. Which one is your favorite technique? Let me know. Or if you have another one altogether that you recommend I try out, I'd love to hear what your favorite techniques are on your Gelli plates. If you want to see more complex Gelli plate printing, let me know as well, as I wanted to keep these very simple. But thank you so much for watching. Your support means so much, and I can't wait to see you next time.